Hello, I'm Dan Gibson.
And I'm Chad Dole. In this video, we're going to study the long-neglected mosques in the ancient ruins of Dura and what they teach us about the pitfalls in identifying early mosques.
Before we get into all of this, I'd like to ask a question. How does one identify a mosque from any other structure? Now imagine that all you have is the foundation of a building. Over time, the structure is disintegrated, and all that's left is the foundation and perhaps a few walls or columns that are maybe a meter at the tallest. This is often all you have to work with when you are looking at the earliest mosques.
Well, I think the easiest answer that most people would provide you is that you look for a mihrab niche, find the niche, and you are sure that it is a mosque.
That's absolutely right, but if there's no obvious niche, is it a mosque or isn't it a mosque?
Now, obviously, Dan is going somewhere with this because he's done this a few times. There has got to be more evidence than the niche. You have examined hundreds and hundreds of mosques. What have you noticed as you've studied them?
Well, I have a mental checklist that I run through, and they're not in any particular order, but the first one is obviously just to check if there's a mihrab. If there's a mihrab, then you know it's a mosque. Next, I would want to know when the Muslim armies actually conquered the city. And if it's before the time that the mihrab was invented, I wouldn't expect a mihrab, although it might have been added later. So I would check for other indicators.
What other kinds of indicators can you look for?
Well, the mihrab was developed during the time of confusion. That's when mosques were facing different directions. So we have the database now with over 200 mosques, and we can check for other indicators. Mosques were often wider than they were deep. For example, mosques usually have the door at the back, and the Qibla wall is directly opposite when you come in. Second, one should check the direction that the pillars run. If the wall we think may have been a Qibla wall is the widest wall, we have strong evidence this could be a mosque. And then if the pillars are placed so that the audience can sit or stand in wide rows facing the Qibla wall, the evidence grows stronger.
What about the direction the Qibla wall is facing? That's an obvious question for your work.
Right, and this is where some of the archaeologists have stumbled, because if the Qibla wall is not what they expected, they will not recognize the building as a mosque. Archaeologists naturally look for the Qibla wall that should face Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And if there isn't one, they rule out the building as a mosque, and they call the structure a chapel, sometimes even a palace room. And they may have some other classification. Up until our worldwide study was complete, it was not evident that the very first years of Islam, the Qibla direction faced towards Petra, and then later towards Mecca. However, once the mihrab niche was introduced, we could clearly see what direction was intended. Even then, in some cases, the mihrab niche did not face Mecca in Saudi Arabia. We have mosques that face Petra and face other directions.
So you check several things. You check Qibla walls, you check the direction of columns for wide rows so that Muslims could stand together, and you check the Qibla direction that matched one of the other Qibla directions which you'd already discovered and saw how they would fit into the pattern.
Now you've got it.
Now we're going to look at Dura and how it is a perfect example of how mosques can be missed when they have an earlier Qibla and people don't recognize exactly what's going on.
Back around 300 BC, the Seleucid Empire founded the city of Dura Europa on the southwestern bank of the Euphrates River. Remember, after Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was divided between his generals, and one of those divisions was given to the Macedonian general Seleucid Nicodor, and it became the Seleucid Empire, and it survived as an empire until it was conquered by the Roman Empire in 63 BC. So this city was first called Europus, and later in the 2nd century it was known as Dura, or the fortress. And today the ancient site is known as Dura Europus, the two names have been combined.
It's an interesting city. It had a number of important structures around its western wall, including a church, a synagogue, and temples dedicated to Greco-Roman and Syrian Aramean deities. During the ongoing wars with the Persian Sasanians, these buildings were seized by the Romans, and they were covered with earth and debris to create a massive defensive wall. This wall strengthened the fortifications of the city, while the construction of this embankment preserved all of the buildings underneath, and it was a treasure trove for archaeologists. The rest of the city was destroyed by the Sasanians in AD 256.
In the 1920s, British troops stationed there discovered a well-preserved ancient wall paintings, which, while they were digging a trench, typical World War I back there, digging trenches, discovered this, and so they asked for an archaeologist to come. In the spring of 1920, the famous archaeologist James Henry Breasted happened to be surveying the upper Tigris River, and he was persuaded by Colonel Arnold Wilson to assess the finds reported by the Army. So Breasted spent one day at the site, making notes and sketches.
And so in 1922 and 23, Belgian archaeologist Frans Koumant led two short archaeological excavations at Dura before the political situation made it too difficult for him to continue. It was not until 1928 that excavations would resume, this time sponsored jointly by the French Academy of Inscriptions and Letters and Yale University. These excavations continued for 10 seasons between 1928 and 1937. Most of the surviving artifacts from Dura are kept in collections at Yale University and the National Museum of Damascus. However, for nearly 50 years after the 1937 excavation, there was very little archaeological work done at Dura.
Then in 1986, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Syrian Directorate of Antiquities established the French and Syrian mission of Dura Europa to re-examine and to preserve and excavate some of the things that were there. Their work at Dura continued until 2011 when Syria erupted into a civil war. So Chad, what about the Muslims? What was their history in Dura?
In early 634, or year 12 of the Islamic calendar, the Muslim army swept toward Mesopotamia and reached Dura. The Muslims called Dura Al-Farad or Al-Salihiyah. According to Al-Tabari, Khalid fought a pitched battle there against a mixed force of Romans and Persians, since Dura still marked the border of the empire at that time. Khalid was victorious, and Al-Tabari reports that 100,000 men died in the battle. Even if the numbers are exaggerated, the point is it was a major, hard-fought victory for the Muslims. After that battle, Khalid stayed in Dura for 10 days before quietly departing for the Hajj. None of the early maps, charts, or drawings of Dura mention any mosque in the city. As far as the archaeologists of the 1920s and 30s were concerned, there was never a mosque in the city. Did this Muslim conquest truly not have a mosque? Or did the archaeologists simply not recognize the mosque that was there?
Please remember that at this time, up until the present, most archaeologists identified mosques using two criteria. It was expected that the mosque should face Mecca, and second, it should have a mihrab niche. In ancient Dura, there is no structure that fits this description, and so they assumed there was no mosque, and thus no Muslims present in the city. This helped them to conclude that Dura had long ceased to be a functioning city when the Muslims arrived. Many archaeologists have assumed that Dura had not been occupied since the Sassanians destroyed the city in AD 256. You see, at Dura, they found the remains of a siege ramp, mines, countermines, as well as military equipment, and they assumed it all to be Sassanian because they did not recognize any of the mosques. And so, in their report, no mention is made of the Muslim invasion and the presence of Muslims living in the city thereafter.
Right. And to everyone's surprise, when you released your survey of early mosques from the first 3 centuries of Islam, You listed 3 notable places of Muslim prayer in Dura. I'm sure people didn't take it seriously when they saw that if there's never been a record of these mosques there.
Yeah, this is one of the problems I face when I contradict, archaeologists at some point. I identified 3 places of Muslim prayer in Dura. The easiest was the small Rashidun Mosque. Then later, a larger congregational mosque was built, complete with a massive mihrab, and there was also a large early Muslim qasr, or a large manor house, with the same orientation as the congregational mosque.
So why don't you explain what is a Rashidun mosque and how do you identify a mosque that is that early?
The Rashiduns were the first 4 caliphs that ruled, and their mosque was constructed, all of their mosques, before the mihrab niche was created. And it's easy for archaeologists to miss it. And so no one had done a survey of all the mosques around the world, and so they didn't realize that over 60 mosques faced the city of Petra in southern Jordan, and many of them without a mihrab niche. So this structure did not face Mecca, and it did not have a niche. So archaeologists in the 1920s, 1930s assumed it was not a mosque. Now, there are other things that help us today. We can compare this structure with other Rashidun-era mosques. And these were small, usually wider than they were deep, and so Muslims lined up shoulder to shoulder, or they sat on the floor facing the Qibla wall. And this is exactly what we see in Dura. We have 2 rooms, each 7 meters wide, but only 2.5 meters deep, and it faced Petra.
It looks like there is a larger mosque that was built right over this early mosque.
Yes, when the first mosque became too small, then an area was cleared, and so that a larger congregational mosque could be constructed. The larger mosque was about 30 meters by 30 meters, but it faced the between Qibla. And it had a large mihrab structure on one side, 3 meters wide, only 2.5 meters deep. And since it was constructed of clay bricks, it has weathered badly. And it can still be seen today, however. And there is something unique also about this mosque. The builders left the earlier, smaller Rashidun mosque right in the middle of the later mosque. So you can see that as you look down on satellite images. You can see the structures built. Older structures are built as part of the old mosque.
It's always interesting when you can look at an image like this and see 2 different Qiblas in the same place, and neither of them are Mecca Qiblas.
Yes, to the north of the congregational mosque are the ruins of a Muslim qasr. This structure is about 44 meters by 48 meters. Some of the north wall has fallen into the encroaching river. This qasr is very similar to other Islamic qasrs, with a large inner courtyard and rooms surrounding it. The qasr is oriented so that every room has a Qibla wall facing the between direction. However, since it does not face Mecca and has no mihrab, the archaeologists missed the fact that it was an Islamic structure.
The archaeological reports tell us that such a large grand structure must have been a palace, and indeed they found an inscription nearby that mentioned the Palace of Dux Rapay, or the head of the river. The inscription credits the original structure to have been built by Elagabalus between AD 218 and 222.
However, Muslim builders were well known for using existing building blocks and old inscriptions when they built their new qasrs in their mosques. According to graffiti found at the site, the head of the river, Domitus Pompeianus, had apparently lived in the central and largest suite that opened onto a terrace that overlooked the river. So the archaeologists assumed that the palace followed the standard model of a Roman villa. However, the flat roof does not belong to a Roman tradition, but it was used in the later Muslim qasrs.
The archaeologists did not consider this qasr further, perhaps because they were focused on the spectacular remains of the synagogue and those temples we mentioned. Early archaeologists often behaved like treasure hunters. The amazing finds at Dura were collected and shipped away to distant museums. From then on, no one believed Dura had a mosque or any evidence of Muslim occupation until Dan Gibson recognized these structures as Muslim structures. They were aligned to the Petra Qibla of the Rashidun Caliphs and the between Qibla of Hajjaj bin Yusuf. I looked at some of the arguments against the Muslims occupying Dura, and one of them is a lack of Muslim coinage and pottery found at the site. So what do you think about that objection?
It's important to get a timeline in your mind. The Islamic invasion of Dura occurred in 634 or 12 after the Hijrah. It seems the Muslim armies arrived quickly after the beginning of Islam, and they moved on shortly afterwards, probably leaving a skeleton group to manage the city. Dura Europa was no longer the border between two great empires. It barely gets mentioned in Islamic records, save for it being mentioned in Al-Tabri's Chronicle. The only evidence of Muslims in the city are the small Rashidun-style mosque that would maybe hold 100 people or less, and then a short while later a congregational mosque that faced the between Qibla. So an older style qasr was built out of sand and bricks, clay bricks, and there's little evidence of any maintenance on those structures. And so they eroded very quickly. A few years later, no one bothered to build a new Mecca-facing mosque, and it seemed all the attention moved on to elsewhere.
So where did all of this attention move? What else was going on in the area at the time?
The city of Kufa was built in 638 or 17 after the Hijrah, and it was about 450 kilometers away. It was instantly the seat of Islamic government, and all the great Islamic structures were built there. 65 years later, Hajjaj bin Yusuf then built his own city and called it Wasit. And this is in 702 or 83 after the Hijrah. Dura Europa was left with a small group to manage the city until the city faded from existence.
So the Muslim occupation of the city was quite small, and more important centers were rising elsewhere during this time. Why didn't they find Islamic coins and pottery at the site?
The answer is quite simple. There wasn't any Islamic coins. Remember, the Muslims arrived in 12 after the Hijrah. The first Islamic coins were struck by Abd al-Malik and Hajjaj in 697 or 78 after the Hijrah in Damascus. This is 66 years later. So the Islamic coins were not struck in Kufa until over 100 years after the Muslims had conquered Dura Europa. Same thing happened with pottery. As the Muslim armies marched, they used the pottery that was made in the city they conquered. A distinct Muslim-style pottery was not firmly established until the 9th century in Iraq and Syria and Persia. This began around 820 or 200 years after the Hijrah. So in my view, claiming there were no coins or pottery does not prove that there were no Muslims in the city.
That's quite well argued. We've talked about the minting of coins before, and if the city was slowly in decline, we shouldn't expect to find those kind of material evidences there. They didn't even exist yet.
That's right. And usually coins were buried when somebody's attacking, and you bury your coins. Nobody was attacking. Nobody was burying coins. I hope you've enjoyed this YouTube video. And be sure to subscribe. It is very helpful. And we hope to examine other mosques that are very interesting, have something interesting about them in the future.
Hope you enjoyed it. Take care.
I'm Dan Gibson.
I'm Chad Dole.
Bye-bye.